aggressively recommend to people. I aggressively recommend Legendborn to my friend and former colleague who went to Chapel Hill and cherishes her time there. Oh, geez, you have to read this. To my friend who loves fantasy and any story with a strong female character, add this to your book list. To my brother-in-law, who has always been intrigued by the Knights of the Round Table, man, this is such an interesting take. You got to check it out. Eventually, it basically just became, hey, do you like to read? This book is awesome. You want to borrow my copy? I mean, I honestly can't say enough good things about Legendborn and how I thought it was so creative and heartfelt and honest and absolutely perfect for our community to read as part of this year's Read Davidson selections. But enough of me fangirling over this work. Let's introduce you to our speakers for the night. First, we're so excited to have Dr. Hilary Green with us here this evening. Dr. Green, a U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction scholar, joined Davidson College this academic year, serving as the second Vann Professor of Ethics. Dr. Green has focused her recent scholarship on how African Americans remembered and commemorated the Civil War, and on the often unacknowledged history and legacy of slavery on university campuses. Over the course of this academic year, she shared her expertise with the Davidson College community and has served as a valuable resource in the broader local community as well. I've had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Green speak about her own work and the work she's been doing with Davidson students, faculty, and staff on campus. As a former history major, hearing her contributions to Davidson makes me wish I was able to go back to school and enroll in absolutely everything she's been teaching. Dr. Green earned her bachelor's degree in history with minors in Africana studies and pre-healing arts from Franklin and Marshall College, a master's degree in history from Tufts University, and her doctoral degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She was also listed in Legendborn's acknowledgement section, thanking the author's research consultants, subject matter experts, and authenticity readers. So it's obvious Dr. Green knows her stuff, and we're so thrilled to have her as a part of this conversation. Welcome to Dr. Green. Then we have the woman behind the magic. Tracy Deonn is the New York Times bestselling and Coretta Scott King John Steptoe Award-winning author of Legendborn, and a second-generation fangirl. She grew up in central North Carolina, where she devoured fantasy books and Southern food in equal measure. After earning her bachelor's and master's degree in communication and performance studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Tracy worked in live theater, video game production, and K-12 education. When she's not writing, Tracy speaks on panels at science fiction and fantasy conventions, reads fanfic, arranges puppy play dates, and keeps an eye out for ginger-flavored everything. Welcome, Tracy. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm still just sort of reeling at the way this event has come together. I'm really honored to be. Is it the first YA selection for Read Davidson?
Yes. Yeah, this is the first time that we've ever chosen.
That's amazing.
A YA.
That's amazing. To be an inaugural choice, but also just sort of the kismet of having Hilary here. And this is the first time Hilary and I have spoken sort of face to face. I just want to say, even though we've talked a lot. So I'm just really, this is a wonderful event. Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I was going to say, I'm going to fangirl here. Thank you for this event, and thank you for putting together, and thank you for selecting just an amazing book. So
absolutely. So before we launch directly into the program, at this point, I just like to let everyone know you all are welcome to submit questions via the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. I already see a couple rolling in, so thank you for that. Following the conversation, select audience members will, or select audience questions will be moderated by Beth Helfrich, the wonderful events manager at Main Street Books, and she's also a valued Read Davidson committee member. So now, without any further ado, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us here for this important conversation tonight, and I'll turn things back over to Dr. Hilary Green and Legendborn author Tracy Deonn. Thanks so much.
Wow, Tracy, this is great to be on screen.
I know. I feel like I'm just grinning, but mostly I'm so happy, and I'm happy that I get to say to you, to your face, thank you. I mean, the subject matter expert, consultant, and authenticity reader, you were all of those things in one person, and just the perfect person that to help me make a lot of decisions about what I wanted Legendborn to read like on the page, but also you affirmed me about what I was doing at a time when I felt really vulnerable and wasn't sure that it was the right thing. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and as I have my copy here, and I recently got a copy from my dad, who was spying it on my shelf. He's like, "What's this book?" And flipping through it, I'm like, "Okay, I'll go get you a book, because otherwise I wouldn't have this copy anymore." So I wanted to say, a lot of people appreciate this book and been picking it up and reading it and loving this. And one of the things I will say is, as a fellow Tar Heel, and I have my little Julian pin here, every time I present, I have my Tar Heel gear on. Why did you choose to set this book, this YA book, in Chapel Hill?
There really wasn't any other place it could be. I will say that for the first half, maybe even more of my time working on Legendborn, I was using the history that I knew from UNC, the history I was researching about UNC. The wonderful thing about that school is, because it's the oldest public school in the nation to graduate students, there are tons of resources about the school, and the school itself has wonderful archives and primary sources. So I was using those, but it took a minute for me to decide to call it UNC Chapel Hill. It was always UNC, in spirit and truth and history, in texture and how it feels, the campus. But to say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to call it this other made up fictional name. I need to actually name the school for what it is. I think it's necessary. I talked to people about it. I talked to you about it. I talked to other friends and talked to my editors. We had to get a legal read from Simon & Schuster, because naming it a real place changes things. I did what I called a UNC pass late in the revision process. I think I took like 10 days and flew through that book to make sure that it became UNC in all the small ways. So how much time does it take to walk from this part of campus to that part of campus? I really wanted, once I made the decision, I felt like it was really important for me to commit all the way through and be able to name sort of off the top of my head the changes that I did make, because those were going to be like fewer than 5. Yeah. And then everything else to stay the same.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really get to. You get a sense of the place, how long it takes to walk across the campus, the geography, the things. So this is really, and then also too, the hidden history, the hauntings of race that permeates there. And one of the things I really got was there is, as a student there with Silent Sam and race and everything else, it felt like that slave past was haunted. And yet you use a Black girl and Black girl magic, the haunting of this, the sci-fi and that fiction, it helped take and transform this history. But you needed to know this was Chapel Hill. You needed to understand that place, because otherwise you're like, what's this school? That's not my experience walking across school.
Yes.
That's not my experience coming off of Franklin Street.
Yes.
That's not my experience here. So that's one of the things, as I picked it up, and I've been recommending all Tar Heels, it's like, you need this book. Yeah. We need this book. How do we get there? And I so appreciate that you embrace fellow Tar Heel love and going through this. And then also too, setting it as a young African-American woman. And I love the protagonist and your update of this Arthurian story. What was your inspiration for her? And the other question I have is, how has she been received by other young African-American girls and people of color who don't see themselves in YA, but have this strong voice, this strong magic and sci-fi? Because she's such a strong person.
Yeah.
In this.
Bree is, I'll answer in reverse. The reception to Bree has been remarkable. I think of all the things that happen when you release a work of fiction out into the world, hearing back appreciation about the things that feel very personal to you is really profound. So I've had a lot of people say that Bree has Bree sticks with them after they close the book, that they think about her, that they think of her as a real person, that they think of all of her vulnerabilities and her strengths, and just the wide range of emotions that she's allowed to have. And how, for me, it was important that I had a Black teenage girl be able to drive an entire book through just the power of her emotional state, that her emotions mattered so much. They could be the engine for all of the plot. So what she thinks about, what she feels, the convictions she has, the uncertainty, all of that stuff is behind her decision making. And I wanted that to be, and also I will say she's angry, right? Like she's allowed to be angry. She's angry from the beginning of the book to the end. Bree doesn't ever, like, she has varying levels, but she holds on to a lot of rage. And there's even, passages in the book about what that rage is used for and how important it is. And I just needed Black girls to know that they can be angry. There are so many different ways in which society tries to police women's emotions, but particularly Black women's emotions. And I wanted to let Bree, I didn't want the fix to be Bree feel it's all over now and Bree's no longer grieving, and also she's not angry anymore, she's happy. Like, I was like, that can't happen. So I think that's partly why she resonates, because she's still allowed to be that person. And so my inspiration for Bree was really my own personal experience. If you've read the book, read the author's note, my mother died when I was young, not as young as Bree, but I was young. And I remember asking the question I think we all ask when we lose someone we love, why did this happen to this person? And pretty soon, I think like a week after, I started asking questions about my grandmother as well. I knew she had passed, and it turned out that my mother lost her mother around the same time as me, like within a few months, maybe 2 months. And then the same thing had happened to my grandmother and my great grandmother. So I never met my grandmother, and my mother never met her grandmother. And so this sort of like matrilineal loss was really interesting to me. And I'm a creative writer, I'm a fantasy person, so, and a YA writer. So I immediately thought of a girl who could go on a quest to answer one of the world's most impossible questions, which is, why did this person die? Like, you're not going to get an answer really in real life, not a full one, even if you have the narrative, the medical narrative, you still won't really have the answer that feels enough. But I wanted Bree to be able to go on that quest. And so that's really where she started. And then between that and deciding to set it at UNC, which I think part of what I wanted was to show what it's like to, close first person, what it's like to walk in that space. She sort of bloomed from there.
Yeah, and one of the things too, that experience of coming from the central part of the state into UNC, that landscape changes you get, her anger, that sense of loss and not knowing identity, and coming to a very much a campus that is not always welcoming for Black girls and Black women in particular.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you talked about the range of emotions, because one of the best scenes is her getting ready for a dance, and like the hair choice of hair. I'm like the realist, like where you get your hair done, where you get these stuff, where you get clothes, how you do these things. And you made her full, but you showed the range of emotions. It's okay to have those range of emotions. And also too, with the history of that campus, a Black girl navigating that space and consciously aware in that identity of people who can give multiple generations. You're there, and she does it. So you're seeing this complexity, and she just leaped from the page. And I just couldn't get the book down. I was like, okay, I need to know more. And I'm like, yes, you deserve to be angry. Yes, you can have joy, but you know what? Yes, your hair needs to look good tonight because you're going to this.
Yes, and she can have a scene where she's frustrated because demon gunk is in her hair, and now she has to wash her hair before she had scheduled herself to wash her hair, and to have that level of frustration. But she can also have a scene in the book where doing hair is self-care, and she has the time to like love on herself and deep condition and all of that. And I felt like that was really important too, because I myself, and I think a lot of Black women can identify with this, there's like a range of love and a range of frustration you can have with your hair, because it feels like a living thing, and you're in sort of discourse with your hair depending on the day, and so I wanted to be able to put in little moments like that, because I'd never seen it, particularly in a fantasy book. I just never seen that be an issue. Yeah,
and it never is. The fact you have that she like, and she's just like, why? Just like, and I'm like, I hear you, girl. I hear you on this.
She has to deal with like her hair on the pillow. Like, she's like, this is not a good pillow for my hair. Am I going to get up? What am I going to do? Like I love those moments too. They make me smile.
So I'm so glad to hear that she's been well received because of the range of emotions, and she's not flat. She's a full person and a full character. And I think so many YA novels need to do this. Like,
Yeah.
you create a space for future novels and future characters to say this Bree can exist as well as other Black girls can exist, and Black girls in fantasy. Yes, we're here too. We can do this. So Bree is, again, one of my favorite recent characters I've read on the page. But the other thing about Bree, and this is here, UNC, Davidson, University of Alabama, a lot of colleges are dealing with this history of race and slavery. And Bree's engagement with this history is very unique. And I think you make a contribution that most people haven't thought about, the creatives. How can you use sci-fi? How can you use another medium and not just the fear of reparations, and shuts down, but you can use a Bree to help push these conversations open in newer ways. So I was thinking about, and especially the first time I read it, and then the second time I read it, once it came out, how might campuses use your book, but it's a common read? And I love that Davidson's doing this, because I know so many of my students are probably going to pick up your book if they haven't already, and I can bring it into class and they were like, yes, we're reading this, and they'll be okay. But how might your book be used by other institutions, including UNC Chapel Hill, that is still ongoing and fits and starts? And I wish they would have talked to you and others about this. How can they use this in their truth and reconciliation process and bring about that repair that even Bree as a character is trying to get?
Yes. I mean, I think, well, first of all, I just want to say that I had, I think I had 3, maybe up to 5 Black women, including yourself, read Legendborn in early copies, various early versions, and specifically asked for folks. You were reading for multiple layers, right? And I think almost everybody is always, but particularly I was asking my Black women readers to give me feedback about the experience of Bree, because we're not all the same. We've all had various different experiences. And I wanted to get that feedback because I wanted to make sure that I was doing right by Black women and Black girls. That thought kept me up at night. So, in terms of how books or how schools can use the book, I think looking at, because this is what I was often asking folks to look for, looking at the range of micro experiences, and looking at the range of modern day experiences and the historical ones. Because the thing that I'm able to do with fantasy, and this is a slight spoiler alert, but not huge, I hope, is that we're allowed to go see things that have happened in the past. And magic made that happen for me, that Bree in first person could go in the past and be able to see something and experience something. And those were scenes that I definitely asked you to read for as well, for authenticity, and be able to come back to her life on campus and look at the world through new eyes, having seen that and experienced that. So when I say the micro to macro, I mean, one of the things that is interesting that people will say about Bree is they'll say she's really strong. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. And they're like, she never, she always speaks up when there's injustice. And I'm like, that's not true.
That's so true.
I'm with you. And then I jump off the train, because that is not true. She does not speak up for, injustice every single time it shows up on the page. And there are microaggressions that Black women and Black people have to deal with, particularly in PWI spaces, that we have to pick our battles. Because to be strong, and particularly to ask or expect Black women and girls to be strong all the time, is just a demand on our labor and our spirits. It's just unfair. That's like, we are resilient, but that is not the labor that we should have to do all the time. And in fact, we shouldn't, the idea of strong Black women, I think, is something that I wanted to work against, because Bree's vulnerable. And there are times when she does not fight that fight. Microaggressions are the sort of, and racism on campus are the environmental antagonists in this book. So Bree has a mission. I think it would be important for people reading the book to think about it this way. Bree has a mission and it happens to take place on a campus. And her mission is what happened to my mother. And she goes through a lot of different challenges and takes on a lot of different challenges to get the answer to that question. But the constant from the beginning of the book to the end of the book is the environmental antagonism of racism, because she is on this campus, because she is among a lot of white people, and because she's dealing with white people who have not been around other Black people. So there's this low level of strain on her throughout the book that has nothing to do with her mission, but continues to get in her way and be an obstacle and have her make decisions about how to spend her energy. Does she fight back at the dinner table with Vann on his level, or does she fight back in a different way? And should she lay low? She was, she shouldn't be standing out here, but how much can she take? And then after that fight, does she tell Nick exactly what happened? Or is the labor of explaining racism to your white friend, even with their best intentions, too much for you, and you just got to stay on mission? That is racism. Like those experiences throughout the day, she has another mission. Students on campus at UNC and Davidson and other places, they're there to get an education. They have personal reasons. Maybe they want to have the college experience. They want to meet up with their boyfriend, whatever. They have all these other things, but racism is still there as an obstacle that they have to navigate. And it's just as minor as the air changing when you walk into a room, and just as major as something like walking past a statue that for a fact was raised up by somebody who dedicated that statue and gleefully talked about whipping someone who looked like you. So I think that's probably that's the way I would position it, is just think about her goals and then track the things that get in her way, and what she chooses to do with that and how that drains her energy.
Yeah, and that's where setting at UNC matters.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't know the place and this longer histories of Carr or the unsung founder hero, and she's just like, I just want to know about my mother. I just want to know here.
Yeah.
That larger history is there on the macro level than those daily aggressions and her time and energy, and how campuses, even with the professed value, you have a Bree who's constantly, do I spend my time? Is this worth my time? Do I have to? And even raising the questions of empathy and getting people to think about and empathize with Bree and what she does and when she chooses not to speak up versus when she does, because she's doing these calculations.
Yes, she's constantly doing the calculus, and Black people in primarily white spaces are constantly doing that math of okay, do I call this out? Do I call that out? One of the things I think more people are sort of verbalizing in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in the last year, is that if you have BIPOC friends, if you have Black friends and they don't talk about issues of race around you, it's because they don't feel comfortable doing that with you. And that's a you problem. And I feel like that's something that, even with that moment with Nick, right? It wasn't that he wasn't good enough and he would have listened to her, but she had to decide how much energy it was going to take. And in that moment, she said no, but she says it other times, right?
Yeah.
That happens and it goes back and forth. So there are moments when Nick is aware of racism and he talks about it, but she can't even, with someone she likes / loves or whatever, talk about it all the time. No. So, the idea, I think, that Black students are having a smooth experience because you haven't heard a complaint is one I would trouble.
and that comes so clear. And it's just if you're not hearing, there's something else rumbling behind. And just even getting the sense of those challenges and those Brees and what they're doing, and when people choose to speak up, when they don't, but that invisible labor that's constantly there, and you can see her. And that's one of the things that it really comes out. It brings up issues that most people might not be aware of. And yet Bree's just strong, she can fight. And when she does fight, she chooses her battles, and she can hold her own, but she can also be bold and no, we're okay. That refusal to say no to this labor.
Because that's about survival. And I think that there are a lot of survival choices that happen in higher ed spaces. From undergraduate student to graduate student to professor and on up. And I know that you've experienced this as well. You have to make decisions, you have to make calls about how you're going to maintain, because you have a goal of being in that space for education, either receiving and participating in education or offering it. But then there's a lot of institutional racism that gets coupled with interpersonal racism and all this other
Yeah.
stuff, you know? So I wanted to be able to talk about all that through Bree's eyes. And like I said, like close first person, like this book is
Yeah.
so super close. It's so intimate. I don't really know how to write any other way, but there are moments when I'm like, I am like, you're deep in her head. You're hearing just like her inner monologue,
Yeah.
her non sequiturs. And, you know, I have gotten feedback from white readers who are like, I knew about these things, like I had the idea, but seeing her thought process as she navigates them helps me think about the labor that's under the surface. And, you know, that's not, my goal is not like educate all the white people. Obviously, this book is a celebration of a lot of things, and it's a, you know, it's a balm, and it's also personal and all this stuff. But it is interesting to me that you know, even just the choice of POV has opened some stuff up for people.
Exactly. And it's that POV that I was going to get to the last question before you open up, because I want to read more. I want to read more. So what can you share about the sequel, if you can? Or
it's so funny because I am sitting at the computer where I'm working on it right now, and I had to stop and get ready for this. And I was like, this is going to be so funny because I know they're going to ask. So the sequel, you know, I love character conflicts that come from magic and magical conflicts that help develop character. And I think if you've read Legendborn, you know what I'm talking about. Like there are dynamics and relationships that are very much bound up with magic creating a conflict or restriction. And I love following through on that stuff. So in the next book, there are a lot of consequences that are being played out. One of the things I think that, you know, this is Legendborn is my first book that I've ever written. And this is the first sequel and the second book that I've ever written. But what I do love about sequels is that they can carry out like what happened in the first book and show that it's not over yet, that it's not done. So there's a lot of that going on. If you're aware of Merlins in the book, that you know, this is the book where you're going to meet more Merlins, and you're going to start to see some of the hierarchy and structure that is only hinted at in the first book. The reason that Bree has to infiltrate the Legendborn is because she isn't high enough in the hierarchy. She's an outsider, first of all, but she also has to work her way up in order to have access to people who would tell the truth. And so the, you know, the hierarchy and what does that look like is now going to be coming into play because of how things end at the end of the novel. So yeah, I think I could say that there's more magic. I'm finding new ways even now to build on the magic system that was already in place. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say. I feel like I'm being very vague, but hopefully that helps.
I'm just happy to see set up, and it continues. It just doesn't end here, and I can't wait to read more of this. So I was going to sneeze there for a second. So I want to say again, thank you. And I know we're going to have a bunch of questions, and we'll have someone moderate the chat and hopefully here. But I just want to say before our Q&A comes in, thank you for writing this. And thank you so much, because Bree is amazing. And I will say this, I am teaching this in the fall at the University of Alabama with my grad students in memory. So they'll be reading this.
Oh, that's so powerful. Thank you. And thank you for, like I said, helping me as I was working through the process, not knowing how the book was going to be received, feeling like I was doing something I'd never seen before and worried and not sure. You were very, very helpful in that whole process.
I could listen to you all talk for a really long time. But the questions are now blowing up. At first I was like, oh, I'm going to track these so carefully. And now everyone has lots and lots of questions. And so I'm going to just start here with a question that's maybe a little bit personal, which is about your process. Bree's grief was so raw. What were some of the ways that you were taking care of yourself as you were writing? You know, what's your approach to writing to sort of be able to manage that?
I mean, sometimes the writing, I definitely didn't set out for the book to be therapeutic to me. In it, I wouldn't say that that's what the goal was, but it did, there are definitely moments when it was like that. And actually getting, like, the prologue is a really good example. The prologue is like an experience that I have had, and getting that down on paper, and it was one of those stream of consciousness moments where I was like, I'm just going to just put it all down. And that was really satisfying. And I still go back and read it sometimes because it validates the feelings that I had and sometimes continue to have. So I think that's been really helpful in terms of like self-care, breaks, journaling, talking about like, how do I feel while I'm writing something? And I don't know, just being there, just being aware that there are moments in this book that are upsetting for very, very good reason. And I'm not, that I'm writing that upsetness, that emotional turmoil for a very good reason too. So like reminding myself of that.
Okay, we have several questions about the Arthurian legend piece of this. And so first of all, Ada wants to know, what about Arthurian legend kind of captured your imagination from the get-go? And then a second piece on that is just sort of your views. I know you wrote recently about something on Twitter, I think, about Arthurian legend and fan fiction and how, who owns those stories? Can you talk a little bit about both of those pieces?
Yeah, so I mean, I was, I watched the Sword in the Stone just like, any sort of like 80s, 70s kid, whatever, like that era of Disney. So I mean, I saw that, and I remember reading the Dark is Rising sequence, which I also talk about in the back of the book, by Susan Cooper. The first of those 5 books was, I think, published in like late 60s, and that was, early children's lit, early YA contemporary fantasy, and remarkable work. And I loved how she assumed that the legend was real and then added to it. And I thought that was the coolest thing. So in some ways, there are parts of this book that are such a love letter to Susan Cooper in The Dark is Rising. And I just think the idea of, determining how power is passed along from generation to generation is baked into most of the Arthurian legends, right? Like you have Uther Pendragon, then you have Arthur, and then, he has family members, and what happens, who can pull the sword and what happens then. And I think that idea of tracking power is something that I've always sort of paid attention to. And in those, those stories often are not even just about Arthur, they're about the other people who have to deal with, decisions by people who have earned power or not. So yeah, and then the fanfic piece, that's on Tor.com. It's called every King Arthur retelling is fanfic about who gets to be legendary. And I'm a big fanfic reader, and have always been, and I believe that fanfic is a beautiful part of fandom and also creativity. And part of it is believing that the story that you're working with is a living thing, not a static thing. And that is the truth at the center of all Arthuriana, that the story is a living thing. The stories are the characters, the situations, that someone can get their hands in it and like muck it up. It's sort of the whole basis of the canon for 1500 years. In fact, at some point towards the end of writing Legendborn, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, and then thinking about Arthuriana as a separate thing that I was researching or getting, consultations on. But then I realized, no, I'm doing it too. Like I'm doing the same thing that Monmouth was doing. I'm doing, like I'm not doing anything different. Tennyson was doing this exact same thing. It just feels more, there's primacy because it's old white dudes from a long time ago. And so there's this like sense of like epicness, but I'm like, I'm actually doing the same stuff. I'm messing with the characters and I'm playing with it. So this is a contribution to Arthuriana, just like anything else. It's just, I'm doing it through my lens.
Yes, and some may argue in a much more exciting way. And making really special contributions. There are a couple of questions about, I think you referenced making some changes about the campus itself in Chapel Hill. I'm sensing we might have some Chapel Hill folks in the crowd here. So, can you share a little bit about what you did change or decided to change, and sort of how you made those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, the book is, I hope you get from the book, readers get from the book, that I love Carolina and I love Carolina's campus, but I also need and want it to be better. Like, do better, be better, do better. But I love you, but you can do better. I know you can, is sort of the vibe. And so there were moments that things I knew I couldn't change. I started from there. I couldn't change the cemetery. I could not change the Old Chapel Hill Cemetery. I couldn't leave out that they're unmarked graves. That needed to be important and pivotal. The fact that football game parking occurred on those graves, like, I couldn't change the existence of the statue that we in our world call Silent Sam, which was up when I started writing the book, but came down as I was revising. And I knew that, but the change there is that I needed to change the name. Partially because I was tired of hearing about Silent Sam, like that phrase. I was like, this is sort of like triggering some stuff for me that reminds me of what it was like going there and how they talked about it, and all these, like, the mythology about Sam. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about Carr. Like, I'm here to talk about Julian Carr and this real person who did this awful thing, and this woman who was beaten by him, who was whipped by him, that he was so proud about, and we don't even know her name. So I changed the name because I needed to focus on the work I was doing. And I thought that having it called Silent Sam was going to detract from that. And then when the Silent Sam came down, I was so grateful that I had made that change, because then I didn't have to worry about people being like, oh, where's Silent Sam? It's not on campus. And I moved the Unsung Founders Memorial mostly because it was in an inconvenient spot. But interestingly enough, I was contacted by some of the Reconciliation Commission committee. They're moving Unsung Founders Memorial somewhere. I don't know where they're moving it to, but there have been discussions about getting it off of where it is in Polk Place. So I guess I'm not the only one who's thinking about moving it. And then I changed the lights on campus. This is a very small change, but the street lights on campus when I was there were this rich amber, yellow, orange color, and that made the campus at night feel very magical and creepy and spooky. And it just felt like you were in a different world. And now they have the, like, more energy efficient light bright ones, and I'm like, no, that's not it. So that's a small change, but shout out to the amber lights, because walking around as an undergrad, I remember just feeling like we were, walking through campus to get to a party. It just felt like you were transitioning into a space where anything could happen. And I felt like if I was going to talk about magic and demons, that needed to be there. Trying to think what the other ones were. I think there's one or two more, but that's it.
This will be a scavenger hunt for they're going to start.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the lodge is not in Battle Park, but there is a castle. There is Gimghoul there. I didn't mention Gimghoul. I listed all the names of former secret societies and current ones that I was aware of, but I didn't mention Gimghoul. And I don't know. I just didn't want to put them on blast. Like, something about Gimghoul just feels like, if you know, I'm not going to put them in a book. But I did obviously take inspiration from the park and the space.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Maya from the audience says that Maya did not even notice the amber lights as a change because they were amber in my time too.
Mm-hmm.
They were amber in my time.
Yes, it's such a small change, but it really made things different. It made me feel a certain way.
Okay, I'm glad that this question came up, because the root magic was one of my favorite elements of Legendborn. And so can you talk a little bit about how that became a part of the story? Did you always know that it was part of a magical world that you were going to create? Just the way that the root magic is woven in is so critical and important. Can you just share some more about that?
Yeah. Did I always know? I don't think so. I mean, I knew, yes and no. So root work in the real world is not a centralized practice. It's not, a religion. It's a folk practice with very many different sources, different parts of the South, and different families even have different practices. And I knew enough about those elements that I knew that that was going to be involved in the magic system I wanted to present. And I knew that really there's one system of magic in Legendborn and there's two different ways to use it, or there's one source of magic and multiple ways of using it with multiple rules. And so the same resource is getting manipulated by different people. And that needed to happen in some way that felt very tangible and that I could define, because I feel like that is so much of what the book is trying to wrestle with. It's like one resource, but look at how it gets used with this one group and how they think that they are doing the right thing and how they're manipulating power and how they're locking it up in this very specific prescriptive way. And then look at this other way of manipulating power and how it feels like it's communal and there's an exchange between the people who have passed and your elders, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew that that had to be there. It just so happens that I knew enough about root work and had enough experiences, personal, familial, social, in that world, in sort of those similar traditions that I knew I could create a system that would work. But root magic in the book is not root work in real world, obviously, and so I make sure to define that. But I knew that I needed to show another way of using the same resource, and so that's the thing I started with.
It makes me think, I don't know if you follow or read Sonia Renee Taylor, who's a scholar and activist, but she talks a lot about technology as being something that is actually embedded in people, especially, in Black people, that there's this technology of operating with the world that could be used to envision a different structure of power.
Oh, yeah. I think I've heard that.
I love the word technology, and earlier when you were talking about answering Dr. Green's question about, how can this sort of fantasy, imaginative work be a part of this conversation of change? And so that's just striking something for me, where I'm thinking about you've created or shown very clearly these two different technologies of how to wield the power and how to work with it. And may we build from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I say this, frequently, and I don't know if I got it from Daniel Jose Older, who's another author, or other people, but for most, maybe all BIPOC writing fantasy, magic is power. That's really what we're almost always talking about. Like, magic is not just magic. What we're talking about are power systems and systems of power, and we're talking about being able to manipulate them or uncover them or elevate them in such a way that we can think about them differently when we put the book down and see their analogs. And so that's part of what I was doing and luckily in contemporary fantasy, I can talk about the actual systems of oppression as well as the magical systems at the same time. But really that's what, I needed to be able to talk about systems of power, and the magic systems do that.
That brings up another question, which is, do you have one or a handful of your favorite BIPOC sci-fi writers?
Oh my gosh. I mean, yeah, I'm going to be super just like local and close to my heart about it. I really love Bethany C. Morrow, who I texted like an hour ago. A Song Below Water is a contemporary fantasy story that's set in, I always get this wrong, but I think it's set in Portland, in the Pacific Northwest, and it has say her name themes, but it's about Black women being sirens, and the only sirens in the world are Black women. And it's an incredible contemporary fantasy novel. There's gargoyles, there's just like a lot of good stuff. So I highly recommend Bethany. I highly recommend L.L. McKinney. Nubia Real One is a young adult graphic novel of Nubia, Wonder Woman's sister, that just came out. Always love that. I actually just went back to A Blade So Black yesterday, just reviewed a passage that Elle wrote. I just think that Elle is always bringing, in everything she does, she is also bringing an examination of power and who has it and why to her work.
there are several questions that have been asked about the sequel, or or the next iterations of Legendborn. I think you've shared what you can. But one question that I have is, this book was so well received. It's award winning. It's starred reviews. It's just, how is the writing of the second one impacted by this fandom that you have now?
It has impacted it. I mean, I had heard and I'd been warned by friends of mine who are authors, are like, just be aware that, you're writing in one space that's really hard. I mentioned it several times already, where you're vulnerable, and if you're trying to do something new that you've never seen done before, it's a very scary thing. I've never seen a book like Legendborn before, but it was the one that I had to get out there, and I wanted to try it, and it was a challenge, and that's a specific place to write in. Now I'm in a space where there are expectations and people are asking questions, and I love the questions. It's not a complaint. And there's, theories. People like tagged me in like fan theories, which I think are fantastic. A friend of mine said there's fanfic out, which is wonderful. I can't read it, which is the tragedy of being a fanfic loving person who also writes. But it is, these characters are going home with people. I think ultimately that's the thing that I'm aware of, not necessarily the noise of, reviews and all that stuff. That's there, but that's sort of been there even before the book came out. The starred reviews came out for casual consumers read it. So I had a sense of that type of awareness, but it's when I hear people have just taken Bree inside their hearts, or it's been months and they're still thinking about Nick, or they've reread the book 5 times. I've had people tell me they've read the book 2, 3, 5 times, and the idea that they're spending that much time in the world can only be because it's meaningful. And so I don't want to let anybody down, like that's really ultimately what it is. I don't want to let anybody down. I don't want to let myself down. But I don't want people to, the worst nightmare is that I write the sequel and people are just like, first one was so much better. I don't know what happened, guess it was a one-hit wonder. I mean, I don't think these things are true, but that, there's a small voice every once in a while that pipes up every, 3 weeks or so. That's like, don't disappoint them. But I don't know. I also have to remind myself that place that I was in when I wrote Legendborn was a place of daring and a place of trusting that what I wanted to see on the page was worthwhile and valuable. And so I go back to that place. When I'm working on book 2, I say, you know what? I made a lot of risky decisions, risky in that, like, I didn't know if it was going to work, and it felt like a big swing, and people are responding to those. So I think that I just have to do that again. And if I do that again, if I write from the gut and I make some big swings and I love the characters too, then I think I'll be okay. So it's like is a process.
Yes. Well, as Maya just put a pep talk, there's no way that more Bree, Sel, and Nick is ever going to be bad. We have faith in you, Tracy. You got this.
Thank you. That's the other thing that actually I should talk to, that, readers and fans, they're so, like, it's going to be great and we're not worried at all. And like all that stuff, like, that's amazing. I think it would be different if I had people who are like, I don't think the second one will ever be as good. No one has said that, but you hear that, get said about like movies and stuff like that. But people have been just so loving and encouraging, and people are like, take your time and all this stuff. And it's really lovely to hear people say that.
Well, I think it's testament to these characters that you've created. I mean, it's clear that, some people read for stories, some people read for characters, some people read for the historical underpinnings or the bigger conversation. The reason that I aggressively recommend this book is because it has all of it. And even and this question just came through, the side characters, this collection you have, and especially your seamless representation of LGBTQ plus
Mhm.
characters. There's a trans character or a gender fluid character. It's not even really investigated or examined too much because Greer is Greer. And so one question that came from the audience is, what has the reception been like from the LGBTQ plus reading community about Legendborn?
Really lovely, really wonderful. I think the first time I heard someone talk about Greer, the emotion, just like there was an outpouring of emotion, like gratitude and tears, and I was just really honored to be able to do that. I remember making the decision, actually, because in so much of YA and fiction in general these days, there are scenes where someone needs to be explained in their humanity, or what, you know, needs to be sort of like explained / justified. And you can do that even in sort of like a loving way, but you're still doing something that I wish we wouldn't have to do. And if I'm writing a book that is supposed to stand the test of time, I would hope that in 10 years, this, you know, the freshness of that won't even be a thing. So I remember being like, no, I don't actually need to write a scene where this is explained. And it's interesting, there was a process where someone did think that late in the process that they thought I needed to do that. And I remember being like, no. And I love that that's the thing that I stood my ground on. And that's the exact same thing that I hear from people, that Greer is Greer. We just keep it moving. Like, they're them, and we keep it moving, we keep it trucking, we got other stuff to worry about.
That's right, that's
like,
right.
You know, so
that.
I love that. And I love that, you know, I made a point in the book to not really have people name themselves or claim their identity. And that wasn't necessarily a political decision, although everything's political, right? But it was that my experience, particularly at UNC, was that, I mean, you cannot ask somebody to define their sexuality because they wouldn't know. They'd be like, I don't know, I kissed a girl last week, it was good. You know, like you like, that was a sort of a useless conversation. And so it didn't happen in a lot of my circles. There was just like, oh, I guess, you know, she has a girlfriend, that's his boyfriend, you know. And there wasn't you weren't going to get the sort of like, it's not like The Sims where you get like an identifier. And again, when you're learning about yourself, you don't know, and we're all learning about ourselves all the time. So I don't know, I just felt like that was the way to present it.
I think that's awesome. And that it might tie into a question that came from Laura Beth, who is one of our great friends here at the bookstore and a YA author.
Yay.
And she's here, and she is wondering, and maybe this is part of why you're drawn to writing YA. What about YA resonates with you, and why is that where Legendborn fits for you?
Well, first of all, shout out to Laura Beth Johnson and Goddess in the Machine, and that duology. So just shout out. I'm going to do that because Laura Beth's wonderful, and actually was sitting across the table from me while I was writing Legendborn quite a lot. So thankful for
she says she's saying hi in the chat.
Oh, hi. So, you know, YA, the thing about YA that I love is that we are watching a character discover what they're capable of. And YA fantasy in particular assumes that the character has what they need at the beginning in terms of the core of them, in order to become what they are at the end. And I super love that feeling. I can't stop reading YA because I want that feeling. And I want to, as an adult, I want that feeling that the outcome, the possibility of me is still being written, that I don't have to completely change my entire core of my being in order to become that thing. And so YA is often reinforcing that idea. And also I want Black girls to feel like they can and be and do anything. And YA fantasy in particular is great for that.
Yes. Yay. We have just a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Dr. Green, can I ask one quick question of you, which is, you just said you're going to be teaching this in a memory class, and which I think is thrilling. And can you talk a little bit just about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I do, memory It's a memory, politics, and identity, and I do it on African American memory writ large. So oral traditions and some of the theoretical work, but I always try to bring in novels because it's Black novels and artists that has helped push in against the grain of absence. And I'm like, no, there's some novels here that we can read, and you deal this memory. I use a lot of poetry in the class too, and I'm like, what happens if we read this? Then we go against the silences and against the grain of the archives that people weren't resistant. So for me, trying to weave in a novel, and my students love sci-fi and they love fan fiction too, and they love this because a lot of them are interdisciplinary. I read this, I'm like, no, they will totally get this book, and we will have a whole fun class on the lawn at UA just sitting here reading this book, and they'll be like, yeah, it's my class. What are we gonna do? So for me, this and dealing with the campus history of race and slavery, and another way to think about questions that we're stalling on. How can you use a novel like this, and why a YA novel like this to push communities forward, because they too are college students. I'll get grad students, but they're teaching undergrad, so they completely understand.
Well, I was just going to say, like, you mentioned a walking tour, and I think that could be really powerful. And I know you do walking tours, you know, so I think a powerful tool could be a walking tour with, you know, people who love Legendborn.
Oh, if I was on Chapel Hill's campus, we would totally do this, but we can't. But we can do the walking tour of slavery at UA and read this here. And what is it like to compare both campuses?
So. I should say, like, that would be my dream. That's my new dream, is that I could lead one. That would be so much fun.
I'm putting my name on the wait list. I'm gonna head over on I-85.
Oh my gosh, yes, I would be there.
You'd have to put the amber lights back in for this.
Yes, tour, petition for the amber lights. And I would also have to learn how to walk backwards, like all, you know, tour guides do.
All the tour guides.
Yeah, this is at night. Forget about the day. I want to see this at night.
Yeah.
And going through all these places, amber lights in, and we're just going.
Yeah, especially like that first fight scene with Nick, where they're fighting the Hound, and that scene, I know exactly where that fight takes place and how the setting works and the brick wall and all that stuff. So that would be really cool.
Yeah, well, everyone here is agreeing that they're willing to pay to go on this tour. You just tell us when and where to show up.
Oh my gosh, Simon & Schuster, make it happen.
Yes. Let's do it. Petition. This has been such a treat. Truly, I am a big fan of both of your work. And from the moment, actually, Tracy, I first saw you speak at Children's Institute last summer, and the book hadn't even come out yet. And it was what everyone was talking about. And I saw you in conversation with Danielle, I think. Yes. It was such a brilliant conversation. I think I tried to write down everything you both were saying the whole time. And since that moment, I've been like, I just really want to hear from Tracy Deonn. So I'm so glad. And I'm so thrilled that the Read Davidson committee, as soon as I had multiple readers, they were all completely on board with selecting this book. So we are so honored to be able to put it in the hands of our readers and the town, and we will continue to aggressively recommend it. And with that, I say, on behalf of the Read Davidson committee and the town of Davidson, thank you both so very much for being here tonight, for sharing your time, and we cannot wait to read the subsequent Legendborn books.
Yay, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hilary, as always, just gratitude and admiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Care. And everyone is saying thank you and goodbye, and we hope you have a safe night. Goodbye.
Bye.